In this podcast episode, Robert Pape, a seasoned expert on conflict and terrorism, provides an in-depth analysis of the ongoing U.S.-Iran war and the escalating crisis surrounding control of the Strait of Hormuz. Drawing from over 20 years of modeling Iran-related conflict and advising multiple White Houses, Pape discusses the current military and geopolitical dynamics, including the bombing campaigns, Iran's control over critical oil choke points, the escalating risk of ground operations, and the looming global economic crisis. He also explores the intersection of the war with American domestic politics, the risk of mass casualty terrorist attacks, and the broader regional and international implications involving China and Russia. Pape explains that despite extensive U.S. bombing campaigns, which included targeted strikes killing Iran's supreme leader and dozens of top officials, Iran remains stronger today than before the conflict began. The regime not only survived, but seized control over the Strait of Hormuz, a pivotal maritime choke point through which approximately 20% of the world's oil passes. This control grants Iran enormous strategic leverage, enabling it to threaten virtually any ship attempting passage through the strait with drones, mines, and missiles. Unlike prior situations, Iran is now able to exert military influence that significantly surpasses historical air power efforts, which have never been successful in toppling regimes solely from the air. The scale of Iran's drone and missile arsenals, comprising thousands of units, remains largely intact and capable of saturation attacks that overwhelm U.S. defensive systems. Pape underscores the difficulty in neutralizing these threats because the drones are small, easily concealed in mountainous terrain, and replenished constantly by Iranian production. The episode highlights a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, that was signed by both the U.S. and Iran, intended to open the Strait of Hormuz under Iranian terms. However, this agreement effectively legitimized Iran's control and gave it the authority to set transit fees, thereby establishing Iran as the dominant regional hegemon. Pape elaborates that while some American officials, such as J.D. Vance, approached the agreement as a business deal promising Iran financial incentives to comply, this perspective missed the core issue, the shifting balance of power in the region. Iran's acceptance of many provisions, including temporary fee waivers, signified a strategic victory for Tehran. In response, U.S. officials quickly undermined key clauses through separate agreements that supported Israel's military presence in Lebanon, encouraged uncoordinated ship transits through the strait, and imposed conditions on the release of Iranian frozen assets. Such violations prompted Iran to restart aggressive actions, including attacks on shipping and U.S. bases, escalating the conflict and reinforcing their territorial ambitions. Beyond merely controlling the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is cultivating a broader security resistance belt, extending from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the Gulf. This sphere includes critical allies like the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon, positioned strategically to disrupt any oil pipelines designed to bypass the strait. Although Saudi Arabia and the UAE have initiated pipelines to circumvent Hormuz, Iran's regional proxy influence threatens these alternatives and solidifies its hegemony over Gulf oil exports. Pape points out that Yemen's Houthis have recently shut down a major Saudi port on the Red Sea, further choking oil flows and aggravating the global energy supply crisis. This escalation underscores Iran's capability to pressure neighboring states and disrupt global markets beyond direct military confrontation. A central focus of the podcast is the critical shortage and depletion of global oil reserves precipitated by the conflict's impact on the Strait of Hormuz and regional refinery capacity. Pape notes that the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, once intended as a buffer against supply shocks, has reached its lowest level since 1983 due to massive emergency releases designed to offset the Hormuz blockade. As the reserve depletes, global energy stocks risk falling dangerously low within weeks. Adding to the crisis is the damage to refining capacity, especially in the Persian Gulf and Russia, due to the war in Ukraine, which limits the world's ability to produce gasoline and diesel even if crude oil is accessible. The combined effect increases risks of sharply rising fuel prices worldwide, threatening recessions and economic instability. Pape describes the situation as an escalation trap, where initial U.S. actions, bombing campaigns, and blockades failed to dislodge Iran but provoked retaliatory measures. This has led the U.S. and Iran into a precarious Stage 3 scenario, marked by either accepting Iran's dominance over Hormuz or escalating toward direct ground conflict. He compares the crisis to being on the Titanic, about to hit the iceberg, emphasizing that any military escalation carries immense risks with no sufficient safety nets. President Trump faces a brutal strategic choice: concede Iran's control over a major energy artery and the geopolitical precedent it sets, or attack to reclaim the strait, risking a broader and prolonged war. With roughly 8,000 U.S. troops, including Marines and the 82nd Airborne, deployed near the Gulf of Oman, the probability of limited U.S. ground operations on Iranian soil has risen sharply, estimated by Pape at around 70%. These forces are positioned near Iranian ports such as Chabahar and Jask, likely intended for symbolic territorial seizures aimed at applying military pressure and demonstrating resolve. However, any such incursions would come at a significant human and political cost. The casualties incurred would provoke strong public reactions and intensify domestic polarization in the U.S., where support for the war is already sharply divided along partisan lines. Notably, while general American opposition to the conflict is majority, the MAGA base overwhelmingly supports it, suggesting political complexities in managing public opinion post-escalation. One of Pape's most urgent warnings concerns the increased risk of sophisticated terrorist attacks targeting American troops and civilians globally. Drawing on his extensive research into suicide terrorism, the deadliest form of terrorism, he explains that control over foreign territory by a foreign military is the single biggest trigger for suicide terrorist campaigns. Should the U.S. attempt ground control in Iran, the risk of mass casualty attacks escalates dramatically. These could occur in the Middle East or anywhere with a significant American presence or symbol. Pape fears missile barrages against U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf of Oman, or inspired suicide attacks akin to those witnessed after 9/11 and during ISIS's rise. The U.S. State Department's recent advisories for American citizens to evacuate the region underscore the growing threat environment. These attacks could also amplify domestic support for the war among some constituencies while hardening opposition in others, deepening political fissures. The podcast draws parallels between the current situation and the Vietnam War, especially regarding the political dilemmas faced by Presidents Trump and Lyndon Johnson. Both leaders confronted untenable military engagements with no clear path to victory, yet felt compelled to escalate to avoid political defeats at home. Trump's recent blunt admission at the G7 summit that global oil reserves may run out in weeks reflects the urgency driving his military strategy. The midterm elections, looming in approximately 3 months, add political pressure to demonstrate progress or success, increasing incentives for escalation despite the absence of a sustainable strategic solution. The possibility of a constitutional crisis is laid bare by the contest between the executive's desire to continue military engagement and Congress's control over war funding. Historically, Congress has intervened to halt wars, but presidential veto powers and emergency authorities complicate such battles, amplifying domestic instability. Pape assesses China and Russia's roles as complex but cautious actors in this conflict. China is reportedly more interested in global stability than regime collapse in Iran, recognizing the economic risks associated with energy disruptions. While China is unlikely to directly intervene militarily, it may leverage political influence to protect its interests. Russia sees Iran's war as an opportunity to pressure Europe economically, especially amid intensified fighting in Ukraine. Russia's intent appears to be to exacerbate energy crises in Europe, undermining Western cohesion and weakening opposition to Russian actions. This triangulation of interests among the US, China, and Russia complicates diplomatic prospects, as each actor's goals and risk tolerance impacts the broader conflict's trajectory. Looking ahead, Pape predicts a high likelihood of escalating U.S. military involvement, including potential limited ground operations in Iran, driven largely by the economic imperative to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and the political need to present victories before the midterms. He foresees increased drone and missile attacks, intensifying confrontations, and heightened risks of mass casualty terrorist events. Should Democrats regain control of one or both congressional chambers, efforts to curtail war funding could emerge, introducing further uncertainty and potential for constitutional clashes. Pape cautions that there is no viable diplomatic off-ramp at this stage. The earlier opportunity to declare victory and negotiate was missed, and the subsequent erosion of trust and repeated treaty violations have closed diplomatic windows. He stresses that real hope for the Iranian people and regional stabilization lies years in the future, rather than the immediate horizon. Throughout the discussion, Pape and the host emphasize the immense human toll quietly borne by millions of Iranian civilians caught amid the conflict and bombardments. The psychological strain, loss, and uncertainty shape countless lives, an often overlooked consequence overshadowed by geopolitical abstractions. As the war intensifies, its effects ripple far beyond the battlefield, touching families, communities, and future generations, underscoring the profound tragedy that underpins these global power struggles. In closing, Robert Pape reflects on history and leadership, expressing a wish to ask Franklin Delano Roosevelt about his vision when authorizing atomic weapons development, contemplating whether those in power fully understood the long-term consequences their decisions would shape. This introspective note highlights the enduring challenge for leaders, the responsibility to foresee and mitigate the far-reaching impacts of war.